So we are here today with special guest star, Gabriele Marcotti. We don't do a lot of guest stars in the past on our podcast, so thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege. I don't know that I can quite live up to the star billing, but
Well,
I
yeah,
hope I don't let you down.
it's tough to fill James's seat. I won't lie. Very few people are capable of that, but we'll give you a shot, just this once. All right, so I have lots of questions for you today, and I think it's only fair because you are the man who gets to ask everybody else questions. Like, I've listened to your podcast, I've seen you on TV. You ask a lot of questions, but you don't necessarily answer them about yourself.
Okay.
So let's get stuck in here. First of all, where did you grow up, sir?
So I was born in Milan, precisely at the Clinica San Carlo, whose car park serves as the overflow car park for San Siro
Okay.
on match days. And then when I was 3 years old, my family started moving around the world. I lived in suburban Chicago in a place named Kenilworth.
Yeah.
I lived in Warsaw, Poland. And that was behind the Iron Curtain during something called the Cold War that millennials will have no clue about. And then after that, I lived in Germany, in Frankfurt. And then I lived in suburban New York, in Westchester County, Bronxville, New York. And then I lived in Tokyo for 4 years. And then I moved to London, where I graduated high school. And then I went to college and grad school in the United States.
Right. And did you choose Penn intentionally, or was that like the last possible place that would accept you?
It was, thank you. No. I did choose Penn intentionally. And I'm a proud Penn alum, like the President of the United States and others.
Oh, wow. I actually did not know that bit, but thanks for that. So you're a pretty smart guy, and you had a very interesting upbringing, but why choose journalism?
Good question. So it was almost really by chance. I mean, all right. So ever since I was a kid, I was into, I loved reading. I loved long form magazines. I loved the New Yorker. I got my New Yorker subscription back when I was maybe 13 or 14 years old, and it was a really big deal because I lived in Japan at the time, so it would sort of get there like months late.
Yeah.
But I had a teacher who kind of got me into it and says, like, this is a good magazine story. And no, I mean, I read other magazines too. And I wanted to be one of those, guys who has the big expense account and works for the New Yorker in the wood paneled office and kind of like has, writes like 3 stories a year, but spends months on it. I don't think those jobs exist anymore.
No, but they're amazing. And the stories of those guys and that era and the expense accounts are fantastic. It's not just like Hunter S. There were a number of people that had sort of these profile roles, and people who like live in are aware of the modern media world are just aghast that this was even possible.
Yeah, well, I mean, back then that was also the era when magazines like the New Yorker, Vanity Fair would kill more than half the stories that they commissioned, right? I mean, to get into the magazine, it was a really, really big deal.
Yeah.
Look, those jobs don't exist anymore, like I said, and after grad school in New York at Columbia, at the time, people were saying, "Oh, well, journalism's dead. It's so hard. Blah blah blah." And in reality, it's just kind of funny because the situation was much better back then than it is today, but probably much worse than it was a decade before that. I'd been to the Olympics in Atlanta in the summer of '96, basically by writing to every news outlet I could think of and saying, "Look, I'll drive myself down to Atlanta from New York. I speak English, I speak Italian. Speak some German, some Spanish, so I'll do whatever you want from me. Please just get me a credential. I'll bunk at my friend's house."
So you're the perfect Olympics reporter here in that like you're a polyglot. You can speak a bunch to like different people in their own languages and potentially get more robust stories.
Well, yeah, this was even though I ended up working for a wire service there, so we didn't do too many robust stories, but we did, a lot of quotes, a lot of immediate mixed zone reaction, a lot of kind of the bread and butter that then serious writers use to go and build their own stories.
Sure.
But it was tremendous. You know, it was a tremendous learning experience for me. And career-wise, it also helped because I met some guys from Sports Illustrated, and I met some guys from Corriere dello Sport, Italian Sports Daily. And you realize so much in life is about being in the right place at the right time. And as it happened, that summer was a summer of '96. It was the first summer post-Bosman, when all of a sudden a bunch of foreign players started coming to the Premier League. A lot of them were coming from Serie A, Italian ones like Vialli and Di Matteo, but also a bunch of foreign ones who played in Italy and spoke Italian. So there was a confluence of that. There was a confluence of the fact that the Premier League was finally spending a little bit of money. There was a confluence of the fact that suddenly everybody had a cell phone, and they were generally happy to answer it at all times, which I can tell you isn't the case today. There was a confluence of the fact that I'd graduated high school in London, so I kind of knew my way around. There was a confluence of the fact that my girlfriend at the time wanted to move to London. So post-Olympics, I said, all right, bye-bye New York, let's give it a shot, in London. And I was very fortunate to be able to do that. And in that first season, I was kind of the same age or even a little bit younger of a lot of these, a lot of these players who had been dropped into the strange land called English football. And I can tell you that back then it was entirely different. There were no player liaison officers. I don't want to drop names, but you might have a player all of a sudden, needing a plumber, and they might call me. Or
I was going to say, Gab, you could drop names because you've written some books about these people that presumably had their involvement. So it's not really, keeping it on the low.
Yeah, and I think you might find some of those stories are in the books, but you had this weird situation where a lot of English clubs were spending a lot of money and they really had no idea what they were doing. Not just in terms of scouting, you all heard the stories about Souness and Southampton and Ali Dia and whatever, but just in terms of, all right, how do I create a cultural fit when all of a sudden, nearly overnight, half my dressing room is foreign?
Yeah.
And, when we're used to, it's everything. It's from diet to what the training grounds were like. And so if you had that little edge, if you could communicate across the two cultures, and I didn't just speak English, but, I'd also lived in London. I'd also finished school in London. I'd also, I went to watch a fair amount of football in my last years in school in London at Stamford Bridge, at Highbury, and at Craven Cottage mostly. And I knew what that was. And so that gave me a huge edge. It helped me build relationships, which, some of which continue to this day.
Cool. All right. So I know your Wikipedia page says that you've written 3 books, and I believe that this is probably a lie.
It is a lie.
Okay. How many books have you actually written?
I've actually written, it's 4.
It's 4. Only 4?
Yes. It's, okay, so I ghosted Paolo Di Canio's biography.
Okay.
I wrote The Italian Job with Gianluca Vialli. I wrote an unauthorized biography of Fabio Capello, and I wrote an unauthorized biography of Claudio Ranieri. I also did, and I think on an hourly basis, this might have been one of the most lucrative jobs I ever did. And I still have a credit, I think, on the book. So you don't strike me as a MotoGP guy, Ted, but
this is true.
There's a guy named Valentino Rossi who was a very famous MotoGP guy. I am not a MotoGP person at all. I have no idea how a motorcycle works. I just imagine it's like a bicycle with a car engine on it, but it's probably more to it than that.
Sounds safe.
But anyway, he had a very colorful agent, and this guy wanted to publish his book in English, and he had gotten an enormous advance to go and do that. But one thing led to another. They were way late. They had problems with translators, and suddenly I got a call from my literary agent who's like, look, there's 130,000 words to translate. There's 6 days to do it. They're desperate. And I got paid what, for me at the time, felt like an enormous amount of money. It also literally meant that I was literally, spending 18 to 20 hours a day translating this book from Italian into English, especially a book, not just the Valentino Rossi stuff, but also having absolutely no clue about all the, because there's a lot of technical stuff in there.
Right.
Because Valentino Rossi, as I later discovered, like Formula One drivers, these guys aren't just people who drive or ride. These guys are people who, could be mechanics. So there's all this technical stuff in there that I have to swat up on, and I had a lot of people helping me, but yeah, I was able to do it. So no, I didn't write that book, but I translated that book, and it was an enormous, I know from James I'm not to swear, so it was an enormous pain in my backside to do, but a different experience and very fulfilling.
We don't let James boss us around on this show. You can swear however you want to, sir. It's not ESPN. We're not the worldwide leader. We are Piddly Little Stats Bomb. So going back to those early days, I know that there was like a massive culture shock, and we keep hearing, the media was different then. The exposure of players was different then. There's no social media back then. A lot of stuff like never gets out. But I know, and I've talked to some people like from that era who the foreign players came over and they were just like, they were shocked at the amount of drinking and the culture that was going on in the English side versus like how things operated, especially because Italy was like really quite far ahead of the curve at that point in terms of diet and players taking care of themselves. Like, fill me in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we say Italy. I mean, it's Italian football. A lot of these guys who were playing in Italy at the time weren't necessarily Italian, but they were very much. Italy was pretty much at the cutting edge at the time. I mean, Gianluca Vialli tells a story about when he just arrived at Chelsea and being in the showers, and while he's showering, I've told him it sounds really slightly sketchy when he puts it out like this, but he said he couldn't help but notice, his teammates, and one of them would have a beer belly, the other one would have no definition on his arms, another one would have an enormous jiggly backside, and he'd be like, "Wow, these guys are professional athletes." And again, part of the reason is there were very few specialized sports science or fitness people, if at all, in the top flight in England. There was that culture of drinking that we talked about before, but I think even people who didn't drink or didn't drink much, and believe it or not, there are English players who didn't drink or didn't drink much, they simply didn't have the information. You've got stories from back then. I remember, Niall Quinn talking about at Sunderland, and obviously I guess Niall was kind of covering the time when he was a player at Sunderland, with later being an executive at Sunderland. But he talked about, what great fun it was on your from an away game. What they would often do, especially if they'd won, they'd go to some bar in the countryside, or like a village pub somewhere, and they would have a lock-in, right? So you'd play at 3:00, and then it'd be like 7 or 8 in the evening, and instead of going back home to Sunderland, they go to this country pub and have a lock-in, and everybody would get absolutely hammered, and they'd all pile onto the pub at 2 or 3, into the bus at 2 or 3 in the morning, and they'd get home at X time the next day, and it would all be great for team spirit and team bonding. And then
I've never heard this story. This is amazing.
You must have heard it, right?
No, this is new.
I've heard Niall Quinn tell it, but and then what he found was that years later, during the Premier League era, there'd be times when, and I don't know if he was a manager at this stage or an executive, but he'd be like, "All right, guys, great win away at Charlton or whatever. Hey, how about, we go at the lock-in at, the old Boot or something." And he'd get players complaining, and he'd get players saying, "Actually, boss, how about we don't do that?
Yeah.
Because we kind of want to get back to our families, and, maybe you didn't notice, but, Mohammed doesn't actually enjoy those lock-ins because,
he's Muslim.
He doesn't drink, And actually, it's just the 4 of you there of Irish descent, and maybe the odd Scandinavian guy who sit there and pound, and the rest of us sit around the back and look bored." And so they moved to other sort of team bonding exercises. We've heard of teams going paintballing. It's a bit of the evolution of the game, that, and I think, for all the criticism that sometimes the Premier League gets, I think it's done a better job than most in evolving, in taking some of the best elements from different cultures around the world, and integrating it, into its own.
Yeah, and I know that teams have struggled with that at times as well. Like we were quite well aware when I was at Brentford and even Midtjylland of needing to have somebody on hand to help players adapt, like you talked, like if you need a plumber or to help you find an apartment or where you should live, or like, food is always an issue, and being comfortable with that type of stuff. But for Midtjylland, fairly small place up in Herning and Ikast, like 20 and 40,000 people in those two places. And we had started to look at South America as like a really interesting place and probably undervalued, Colombia, for us to be able to potentially recruit guys. And we got a lot of pushback from the club that actually made a lot of sense, because they're like, look, we just don't have the infrastructure here to like make Latin American players or South American players at all comfortable. So like right now, unless we build that, and we need like a couple people on staff to be able to help them, like we can't do it. And that's true too. You see a lot of that sort of liaison officer that you talk about or whatever, or sometimes football operations people have multiple people on staff to speak different languages to help bed these players in and make sure that they're comfortable, because they have enormous salaries and they're now assets they have to take care of.
Yeah, there's a great piece by my colleague at ESPN, if I can plug my own website, on player liaison officers and some of the requests that they get from players, which is up on the site now. It came out a couple of days early. There's a lot of stories like that. There's one guy who's very you mentioned there's player liaisons officers, and then at certain clubs, especially in London, these are the ones I'm more familiar with, but also there was a famous guy in Liverpool as well, who were kind of like professional player friends.
Right.
They would source things for
the fixer.
Maybe the fixer, yes. Like one guy who served that role for Didier Drogba and a host of other players at Chelsea, and I think a couple Arsenal players. And, it really was like a full-time job. And, and that was necessary back then because, and you'll appreciate this, I remember Gianluca Vialli when he was manager at Chelsea, and they had just signed Graham Lasso for, I think they just taken him back to the club for something like £5 million from Blackburn. And he complained and he said, you see, the problem with this club is that you can get £5 million to buy a left back, but you can't get £500 to buy a fax machine. Which I think is a wonderful quote, because it kind of, there's a lot in there. Obviously, the ethos of clubs at the time, which were just like, well, we'll give you money, now get on with it. But also the fact that, A, fax machines were a thing, and B, that, Gianluca Vialli actually thought that a fax machine cost £500, which I think is kind of funny. I don't think he shops for his own fax machines.
No. So the professional player friend thing, there's a story that I understand from the days of, you remember the Jailblazers era from the NBA? I know you follow some American sports, maybe not this closely. But the Jailblazers existed, and basically I've heard this secondhand, but Paul Allen just was like, I cannot fucking deal with this anymore. I'm tired of being in the press in a negative way all the time. You people have to fix this. Like, get rid of all the guys that are assholes, and then make sure that this doesn't happen again, because I do not want my team associated with this, and it's just endless. And so what they realized was that they had all these sort of 20-year-old kids that were basketball players, and they would go on the road and they did not know what to do. And plenty of them, come from sort of less well-off upbringings, and may have friend circles that are a little rough. And what they needed to do, and what they discovered, was they had to have somebody that was just in charge of finding activities for these guys to kill time on the road, because it is just super boring. Traveling, you have a shoot around, you play at night. I have to kill a bunch of time. And so they had a guy who, they packed trunks full of like PlayStations and Xboxes back in the day to make sure they had video games. They had board games. This guy would schedule like cooking classes for them in different places, potentially for their girlfriends as well. Manchester City has cooking classes for the academy kids' parents, because it's still really important. I heard from somebody just today that Huddersfield had given the parents, while the kids were kind of not allowed to come in, like really specific diets that they're supposed to cook, and the parents are just like drowning under these requirements, because they're I can barely cook 2 meals a day for my kids and have a job, and everybody else's parents are the same way as well. But anyway, so like that sort of professional friend and finding ways for professional athletes to kill time in a positive way that doesn't involve gambling necessarily, that probably involves golfing, as many of them love to do, although less so in England because the weather's terrible. So anyway, American sports. I know that you are an absurdly passionate fan of one particular team. Can you fill us in on, one, how that started? I think I have a guess. And two, the extent to which you follow this team, which I have found fascinating.
Okay. So you're referring to the fact that I'm a fan of the Philadelphia Eagles
Fly,
in the NFL?
Eagles, fly. That is correct.
Yeah. So, well, the way it happened was, as a kid growing up when I was in school, like I said, my last 2 years of high school were here in London. I was way into football. I was a big fan. I mean, the English football, Italian football, and this was pre-Champions League, European Cup, and whatever. I lapped up everything I could. And when I went to I liked American sports. I followed them from a distance. But when I went to the U.S., what I loved was, and this was maybe more a function of being in Philly than elsewhere, was you have if you're a football fan on this side in the old world of the Atlanta, there's a natural ebb and flow to the week, right? So you have a game at the weekend, then you might spend Sunday and Monday reflecting back on the game, and then you start looking forward to the next game, and you have the build up. And of the American sports, the only one that they really offered that was football. And, that's what the Philadelphia Eagles, and this is how I got into it initially, that's what they gave. They play at the weekend. I mean, I remember Randall Cunningham would always get hurt early in the season and there'd be a big problem and stuff. And so, that would happen on a Sunday. And then Monday, and, you'd review the game. And then Tuesday, oh my God, what do we do without Randall? And then Wednesday, you get an injury report. Thursday, you start looking ahead. And it was that kind of granular, all-consuming attention that was paid to it. And that's what I really enjoyed. And I think more broadly, that's what I kind of enjoy in sports coverage, is the ability, because I think a lot of fans are like that. A lot of fans, and I find this a lot, especially with the coverage of lower division football here in England, a lot of the fans know more than, the people who appear on television and in media writing about it, because they spend more time worrying about it,
Sure, and following it and being passionate about it and being on the forums. And I think this time period, like we're recording this during the pandemic lockdown, like, man, you find out an awful lot about what you care about and why sport matters to you. Like, why am I doing this? Well, I feel the absence, and what that means. And sometimes it's a friend group. Sometimes it's just like something to distract you from your job or your life that might be a little bit boring or just, tough to deal with. And sometimes it's just like, it's fun. Like, I like seeing this. I like seeing the expertise and the skill on display.
It's that. I think it's the expertise. It's also then, I mean, you mentioned how I follow the Eagles. So I read the Philadelphia Inquirer. I have a subscription to them. I have a subscription to The Athletic. I obviously read ESPN.com's coverage. I listen to podcasts, Bleeding Green Nation and Go Birds.
You listen to sports talk radio.
Sports radio, yeah, WIP, previously 610 WIP, now 94 WIP. I have a VPN which allows me to listen live. I also listen to their podcast continuously. And part of it is repetitive, admittedly, but part of it is also, I like the fact that when the game is out there, you get little nuggets. You'll notice, what the right guard, Brooks, is actually doing, which most people would never pay attention because there's so much going on in an NFL field or, an American football field at the time. And, I like that. It's satisfying. You look for clues. And I find that in some ways when I, cover the football I get paid to cover, when I watch games, a lot of times I'll try to focus on that. I'll try to look at things like shape and what's happening tactically. And I'll often look for, since we know who the better players are, and what we often ignore is that, and you're the analytics guy, you might tell me I'm completely wrong, but I don't know. Dwight McNeil versus Jack Grealish, for example. Jack Grealish is a better player. He's more famous, blah, blah, blah. But you know what? When Jack Grealish doesn't have a great game and Dwight McNeil has a good game, all of a sudden the difference between the two, the power ratio shifts. And maybe Dwight McNeil has the upper hand in that particular game. Maybe he has the upper hand because of things other people are doing on the pitch. I love that side of things. We can all name as individuals which players are better than other players. But on the day, there's little tweaks that will make one team more likely to win. Or even if they're not more likely to win, it'll make one team win because, as you know better than most with your background, Ted, it's a low-scoring sport, and the better team doesn't always win.
That's true. I like the guys. So I started following soccer, I guess, football in 1998 World Cup, and obviously a very good time to follow it. When I was, not around the same time, I guess, before you moved to London, just after. We could get like Fox Sports World would give us a 2-hour EPL wrap up in the evening that was basically a match of the day equivalent, and it was amazing to follow. But it was actually really hard to get the games live. You could pay like pay-per-view that was super expensive, like $10 or $15 a game or something like that. And then MLS.
Sorry, can I just jump in there?
Sure.
Wouldn't you love to know? Like, all right, back then, 1998.
Yeah.
Like there must have been some executive, whoever had the rights, and says, yeah, you know what the correct business model for us is? And yeah, Premier League, this is what we're going to do. We're going to buy the rights, and then we're going to charge people $15 a game on pay-per-view. Pay-per-view, which I'm guessing is only available in probably like 10% of cable systems nationwide.
Yeah.
This is a really good business model for us to follow. We'll show you.
But you
did you ever wonder
how different it was back then? And they just want the extra money, right? They don't necessarily realize that like growing the game is their biggest possible path to lots of money.
No, so true.
Give me the extra $15-$20 a week from some kid in the United States that suddenly likes us. But anyway, the MLS was on then as well, and one of the guys that I liked was Chris Armas. And Chris Armas was a defensive midfielder, pretty stocky, smaller guy. But his job was to just make everybody else's job easier. A bit like Rino Gattuso, right? Like Gattuso was out there to I
thought you might say Mike Burns or Britt Hager, but sure, like Rino Gattuso, yeah.
Well, I was trying to keep it relevant to people who would know,
All right.
So quick, one more question before we dive into like a much bigger topic. When did you start to become interested and or aware of like the football analytics world? Also, if you haven't seen, I've put some young Gabby Marcotti pictures up here. The guy on the left looks like he could get into some serious trouble. And the guy on the right is judging you. He's judging you for every opinion you might have in the media.
Thank you.
That guy was on the Times, the Game podcast, and he did judge every one of you. So there you go. But yeah, so when did you start coming across the nerds?
Well, I think like a lot of people, a lot of it had to do with the Michael Lewis book. More broadly in sports. I always wondered about it, and being a natural born contrarian who, one of whose heroes was Christopher Hitchens. A very underrated book is Letters to a Young Contrarian, which he wrote in one of the saner periods of his life, I think. If you remember the early days of stats, to me it seemed like a big con job because there was so many bad numbers out there.
Yeah.
Badly collected numbers that made no sense. And you would get people appearing who, kind of spoke as if this is gospel. And I thought to myself, oh my God, look at that freaking weirdo, right? But then what did get me thinking, though, was, when I read the Michael Lewis book, and I was already familiar with Michael Lewis from before, from, Liar's Poker and whatnot, was this idea of, of the metaphysical, right? The idea of those people who, and it's obviously one of the conflicts in the book, right? Where I guess he has like the fat guy who walks all the time, but he's considered rubbish because he looks funny and he's fat, versus the other guy who I guess was Billy Beane himself as a kid who was this phenomenal athlete but never quite panned out. And it's kind of like when sort of the, for lack of a better word, the non-analytical people, they look at, the components that make up a great athlete, and they're really using it to project forward, right? So if I have a guy who's very agile and very fast and very strong, even though he might not have produced anything thus far, I can project forward in that way.
Sure.
Whereas the statistical people or the analytics people, again, I think about the early era, right? They're projecting backwards. And then I forget who the fat guy in the book, in the mic, was it Nick Swisher I'm thinking of?
That sounds about right, yeah.
Right. I thought to me, okay, what they're doing is really interesting, but fundamentally, they're projecting backwards. And then it dawned on me that I said, well, there's 162 games. So even if they're projecting backwards, it's likely that if this guy walked a lot last year, he'll walk along a lot next year. And that's when I thought, all right, can this stuff be translated into football? And my first instinct was like, yeah, except the problem with football is that there's no data whatsoever. So let me put this idea to one side until people started coming along later, and people started publishing stuff on social media. Obviously, I saw some of your posts on Twitter back when you had a horrible picture of yourself where you just kind of looked like a dick, I have to say, like a know-it-all, like a child, but whatever. Darren Altman was another guy who I really enjoyed.
I guess I deserve that for popping up your old pictures here, which I think are they're good.
You go back and find some of your old. Dan Altman, by the way, had a very unflattering picture of himself. It's a picture that made it look as if like he was all nose and nothing else. He has improved his pictures since then. It's amazing now that you guys are all successful. You guys can all get professional photographers to go and take care of it.
We don't, unlike the people in the media. I would say this is actually not true. At our last team day, we did get a professional photographer, and it's not a great picture of me. So I'm going to be the grumpy person in my current image. Anyway, all right. So you came across us and decided that we weren't all clueless or assholes.
No, I didn't think that before, but I always thought like I like their ideas, but it's all contingent on the data, right? And I thought that until the data gets substantially better, I don't know what it means. Like, if you remember, I mean, again, this is old hat to you, but to me, I remember early on, people were talking about sort of shot ratios, right? And the idea of, well, if you take more shots on goal, more shots on target, whatever, it's meaningful. And I was like, well, how is it meaningful? I mean, if a team plays at a higher pace than the opposition, then they'll take more shots, and maybe they're taking more bad shots. And, I don't have this information. I need better data. Right now, this isn't really meaningful. And obviously now that we have shot locations, all this other stuff, I think it is more meaningful.
Yeah, more meaningful, but still not perfect. And that's part of the fun, right? Like, it's you especially get to write about things that are between the lines. Like you can use the information as a background for you, and you can discuss, hey, we're pretty sure that they had 35 shots to 1 and they got a bit unlucky not to pull out a win on this one. But you still have plenty of story that you can tell in there, and you can tell more about the why of it with maybe a little better grounding overall. So I wanted to move on to your recent stuff, because like we're in the middle of an unprecedented time of crisis, especially for football. I know your story this week was talking about the potential of a FIFA bailout fund. Can you sort of flesh that out for us, and then tell me like what the crux of this is and how it might help, or even if it's possible.
Okay, so first I'd go back to somebody I know at FIFA who's made the analogy of what FIFA should be. And isn't yet for many different reasons, which is that he says, in a perfect world, FIFA would be a development organization, right? Like the World Bank, for example. They would give grants to people who need it. They would have people in the field showing them how to spend the money and helping them develop the game around the world, rather than, what they often are. They do give away a lot of money, but they also have a lot of people, stuck in a building. And if you take that argument forward, and this is part of what FIFA have been looking at, FIFA have, sizable cash reserves. It's something like $2.7 billion. And again, for context, UEFA, which is really the only other confederation which has any significant reserves, they have between 5 and 600 million. Although a lot of that's going to be contingent on, a lot of that might go up in smoke because they're going to make losses on moving the Euros and
that
make
one seems
losses
like it's expensive and painful, and then the women's Euros has to move as well, possibly.
Exactly. So the question is, what do we use this money for? And the idea came together is, football's running into a serious problem. There's a short-term cash flow problem, which we read about, and is why in some places players are being furloughed. Why people are talking about players taking pay cuts and whatever. But we also have a problem in the medium term and long term, I think, around the ecosystem in which football operates, which is that we are almost certainly headed into a long economic recession, a long global economic downturn, which means that while there's still a ton of rich people, the rich people are going to have assets that they don't want to get rid of. They don't want to liquidate because they're worth less than what they were before, and they want to build them up again. And they want to kind of, this is what happens. You get this negative spiral in a downturn, right? So the question is, A, in the short term, how do we keep people afloat? And B, can we create conditions so that football can go back to being what it was before the pandemic? Now, bear in mind also, in a lot of countries, we're not talking about a lot of money. On our Gab and Jules podcast for ESPN, we had Jonas Bear Hoffman on, who's the Secretary General of FIFPro, and
right.
He said in a lot of leagues in Ireland, we're talking low single-digit millions, and we can save professional football in Ireland.
Sure. No, I think solving this problem at the smaller scale, where teams do not have these massive sort of guaranteed outlays over the next 3 to 4 years, which is what the Big Five contracts look like, or even the championship contracts look like. Like, those ones are pretty straightforward, right? Like, you can go into Croatia, Serbia, Ireland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and probably backstop them with 20 million without too much of a problem. The problem comes at the very top end of the pyramid, where they've had all this money, but people have been talking about how badly run they are, how much money goes toward expenditure versus revenue, right? Like, some of these teams are paying more in wages than they actually bring in a year. Gambling to get up in the Premier League, gambling to stay in the Premier League, and that's where it's super complicated and to figure out. But yeah, I get where you're at.
Yeah, it's so the issue is, well, I mean, you asked about FIFA's money. I don't think FIFA are just going to go and give away all their money, but they're talking about establishing a fund. There's a bunch of things that they can do. Different confederations step in. They could guarantee loans, same way that, some people are fortunate enough when, they get their first mortgage, their parents might co-sign the loan. FIFA's credit is very good. They could even borrow against future income, create a pool of money, and almost turn it into a big stimulus bill for football.
Sure.
Now, there's two huge problems with this, Ted. Number one is, how do you decide who gets the money and how to spend the money?
Yep.
Given that, as we all know, there's a lot of bad actors in football, from club owners to agents to middlemen to managers to, it's pretty shocking what goes on, and not just at the very top.
It's not as bad as it used to be, though. I think that it's better than it was.
I don't know. Okay. I genuinely don't know. I think in some ways, well, I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but I think in some ways I think it's worse.
We haven't had a recent Calciopoli.
but that's entirely different, though.
I'm
talking about, money laundering, stuff off the books, conflicts of interest.
I understand.
And it's Calciopoli. So, but the other big issue is, the last time FIFA gave away money, well, not last time because they've done it all along, but the reason FIFA had this massive scandal and got themselves in a whole bunch of trouble is because they gave away money, and they created a system of patronage around the world with a whole number of extremely dubious people. And it's not me saying it, it's the Department of Justice and FIFA's own ethics committee, who's banned a lot of guys for life. They were basically synonymous with corruption, right?
The timing of that report and that information coming out, and the FIFA Emergency sort of bailout fund is pretty awkward, I think, in people thinking that, oh yeah, this will be no problem. This is very straightforward. This is anything but straightforward at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you stories about FIFA now. I mean, when the new FIFA administration came in, for example, they still give away money. They give away more money than before, but they have, pretty stringent measures in terms of, you can't just apply for $3 million. You have to then justify it. You got to put it out to tender locally. There's people who go and check on this. And as a result, there's still a lot of money that remains unclaimed because people in some parts of the world have difficulty filling out forms. At one point, and I hope hope the situation has improved since then, but I heard this straight from the FIFA president, Gianni Infantino. Confederations have different committees and stuff like that of people who kind of administer funds locally and whatever. And what FIFA said is like, look, if you're going to have access to FIFA money, we need to be vetted. We're going to do a background check on you. And you need to have a disclosure to make sure that there's no conflict of interest, which is a pretty standard thing, right?
That does seem like a normal thing, yes?
Yeah, not just that, but to avoid embarrassing people, they also said, hey, here's two FIFA employees, two FIFA paper pushers. Why don't you check with them if, your cousin Bob, who you want to put in charge of this thing, if he's going to make it through the vetting process so you don't submit him and then get rejected, right? Almost like a pre-approval thing. Despite the pre-approval thing, and again, this may have changed. This is, a year and a half ago I spoke to him. He said 20% of the names put forward by the confederations failed the FIFA integrity test. Oh, even now, even when they know they're being tested, even when they can find out ahead of time if they're going to pass or not, they still submit these jokers thinking, so that all has to change. And so, what I talked about in my piece is FIFA can lead the way in raising the funds. Ideally, you would have a board of people, and they might be economists and auditors, and ideally, I wouldn't even have football people involved because I don't know to what degree you can trust them. And they would, you would apply to them and say, make a case and say, look, I need this much to meet my expenses. Can I get, an interest-free loan so that my football league here in Burkina Faso can continue for 12 months? And in addition to that, though, and this is one of the keys, if we're going to do that, the same way the IMF does it, when the IMF gives you money, it comes with strings attached. Okay, Burkina Faso, and again, I'm just using them as an example. I have no beef with a Burkinabe FA or Burkinabe football. We will give you, money to meet costs for the 12 months. You'll pay us back on this schedule. But, by the way, you need to pass these rules in terms of transparency. And you need to pass these rules in terms of good governance.
Sure. So you're going to go to the Nigerian league and tell them that they have a disproportionately scary amount of draws. And you need to stop having that many draws.
Look, there's different.
I'm flashing
there's
back
different ways. No, look.
Problems.
I mean, I would, if you were to ask me, we're here in England, right? Yep. First thing I do, I go to the Premier League. Premier League. You have a club in the Premier League called Wolverhampton Wanderers, whose owner also owns 20% of one of the world's, if not the world's, biggest, most powerful football agency. This is called a conflict of interest under any kind of ordinary corporate governance. So either he divests himself of his shares or he divests himself of the club. He can still have his relationship with George Mendes and they can still be buddies. They can't be business partners. That would be a start. Same thing, football league. You need to have rules so that people have to have X amount of liquidity set aside. Sure. So that if I'm a club owner, I can't borrow against the value of the club to prop up, my car dealership over here, right? My other business. This is why clubs go bust. And the main thing that I would argue for is, and I've said this for a long time, and I feel like I'm on my own here, is complete transparency. I don't just want like these weirdo redacted accounts that barely, satisfy disclosure requirements in the Cayman Islands or in the British Virgin Islands or where some of these dodgy holding companies are based. I want actual disclosures. I want to know how much every employee of the club, even the players, I want to know how much all these people make. I want a line item of what you're spending on groundskeeping and tractors and whatever. I want to know how much you're spending on agents' fees, individualized, line by line for every deal. And I want this information to be public, not because I want, some big central oversight committee, although that'd be nice too, like they have in France with the DNCG. I want all this information to be public because the best oversight is the oversight that comes from the fans. So if I'm the owner of a League One club and I'm doing dodgy things, I don't have to sit there and wait for the Football League investigation. I have to put all my stuff online where it's consultable. And I might have 500 fans of my club and a local blogger going through the numbers and saying, well, wait a minute. Why did you go and hire your brother's laundry company to go and launder the kits? Is this okay? Did you put it out to tender? This is how we create integrity. And if we're going to view football as a little bit, at least, as a public trust that has some kind of community value, and then I think this is necessary.
That's something I've really come around on, sort of the public trust element and how this is the thing that happens in the United States that it's just not possible to happen almost anywhere else in the world of sport now. Like, franchises can move in the United States, and actually the leagues tend to use that as leverage to get things that they want from local governments. And here they cannot move. Not in any way, shape, or form. Like, it's happened once or twice, and it's been like disastrous, fallout. And because they are entities that have been around for like 100+ years in a lot of cases, and they are part of the community, and they're community good. So to me, I'm appalled in many ways how many people actually should be failing the good governance test or fit and proper test of new owners that come in. Like, how many people that you could easily look up and say, wow, that guy might be a criminal. Like, it's possible that you shouldn't necessarily sell a club to this person who is not from this country, that also has like a background that is extremely sketchy, and financial issues that also are, easily look upable.
Right. Or even if they're not crooks, they might just be close to insolvent. They might be chancers.
Well, that's true.
So it's funny because I asked this question specifically of a very high-ranking member of the Football Association, who said to me, we tell the Football League, try to give yourself rules. The Football League, and I think that it is a problem primarily of the Football League because they're in this absurd position where, they govern championship clubs who draw 40,000 a game and have enormous budgets, as well as League Two clubs who might draw 1,500 people and have, budgets of $5,000 a year, so to speak. And he said the problem is every time the Football League tries to introduce this stuff, the clubs all vote against it.
Right.
So later I spoke to somebody who owns one of these clubs, and I said, why are you so stupid? Why don't you go and make sure the Football League has real rules so that you don't have dodgepots coming in and spoiling it for everybody? And he said, because the simple fact of the matter is most people want to be able, when they get out, they want to be able to sell to whoever they want to sell.
Yeah.
They want to be able to sell to a dodgepot. I don't care if I'm selling it to, the guy from the Chinese triad who's laundering, $100 million out of Macau. I've been honest. I want to get out. He's offering me what at my asking price. I'm done. I'm out of here.
Sure.
Right?
It's very much about, as an applied economist, and that's what I've really been most of my adult life. Like, it is about incentives, and they want to keep and create as many possible incentives and avenues to cash in the future as they can. It's
okay. So, applied economist, can I ask you a question?
Well,
because this is what I said.
Always make things awkward for me. Go ahead.
This is what I said to the guy from the FA. I said, Greg, there's a simple thing for you to do here. If you say, "Oh, we'd be in favor of more oversight," but the Football League can't because the clubs vote against it, why don't you decertify the Football League as the second to fourth tier of English football? Promote the National League, or whatever the highest tier of non-league football is called, what it used to be known as a conference. Say, hey, guys from here will now get promoted to the Premier League unless you guys give yourselves real rules. And he kind of laughed and go, oh, well, that will be interesting. I mean, why wouldn't that work? Why wouldn't that work in terms of using a big stick to beat these idiots down who are destroying the championship?
I don't have a good answer for that, other than there'd be a lot of litigation, and I'm not sure that anybody has the budget in order to withstand that.
And this is my thing with lawyers, right? I mean, you're from the Midwest. No doubt you're familiar with the Bible. How it says that it's easier. I've said this many times. I'll say it again. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than it is for a lawyer to enter the kingdom of God.
Uh-huh.
That's the problem. It's all these bad lawyers, bad actors, and not all lawyers are bad. Some are good, but the vast majority of these people are dark souls with dark hearts who will tell their clients whatever they want to hear, and they'll litigate and waste everybody's time, all in the name of that.
I'm of two minds on this. Like, one, I want people who come by a club to be able to spend considerable amounts of money on this club to, potentially improve their fortunes, right? But I don't want them to do it in a way that endangers the existence of that club. You have to put in backstops that say that, this goes in as equity and escrow, and, loans are, within a certain perspective not allowed and whatever. But then there's this other thing where, like, no one ever polices it well enough to make that a reality. And I have some problems with, like, the biggest clubs, pulling up the drawbridge effectively with FFP. It's like, well, we got to spend whatever we wanted to, but now no one else can. It's interesting to see UEFA, finally bring down the hammer on Man City, but we feel like that's more because they flouted the rules so strongly, or allegedly, flouted the rules so strongly. I don't know, like, I'm like all over the shop on this because, like, a bit like Americans, they all want to turn into millionaires and billionaires, and so they leave, like, a really a bunch of tax on the table because nobody who ever gets to that level wants to be taxed aggressively. But that's not reality. That's not how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the basic difficulties here, financial fair play is something that, God, I've reported on for like more than 10 years, is I think there's a willingness on the part of UEFA conceptually to relax it, because what they're finding now is that there's a lot of clubs, a lot of big historical brands who have wealthy investors who want to put in money, right? That's why they introduced the so-called voluntary agreement. But they can't, because they've inherited terrible situations from the past, and they're playing catch up. And the drawbridge to some degree has come up. A lot of times it's an accident of geography, right? Simply being in the Premier League. You can be nothing special in the Premier League, and all of a sudden, you have more money than 16 of the 18 clubs in the Bundesliga.
Right.
That creates a problem. The other thing, which is problematic vis-a-vis FFP, is that obviously, as you know, this ties back to what you said before about the U.S. model of sports, is that you're mixing different business models, right? You're mixing clubs that are entirely privately owned with clubs that are not nonprofits and have some sort of community basis, with the model that they have in Germany, that sort of hybrid 50+1 model. And you kind of have like all these different legislations, and it's difficult to find a formula that works. Personally, I think they do need to relax things a little bit.
Well, look at Milan, right? Like Milan had new ownership come in, basically had to take over the club because the last owner defaulted for reasons, apparently couldn't get the money out of China anymore or whatever. And,
yeah, right.
Whatever.
That's what it was.
Right, okay. I'm speaking very cautiously on things like this. But you look at their finances, and it's insane how much they're losing from basically what is already sunk costs that the owners did not have. Like, they did not take on this I mean, they had to take it on, but they did not initially make the choices. These were the past owners. And so in order for this club simply to survive, like, they are going to run financial losses, and then obviously there's the competitive element as well. And should they be getting crushed by UEFA because of this situation? I don't know. I feel sorry for them.
I mean, in that specific case, they kind of have a double whammy, right? Because 2 owners ago, before the Chinese guy Li Yonghong, the last couple of years of the Berlusconi regime, the club ran up enormous losses as well.
Right.
Li Yonghong came in, and more enormous losses. And you can apply for you can apply for what's called a voluntary agreement, which means that you're allowed to have greater losses for a certain period of time, as long as you submit a credible plan about how this is actual investment, and you'll get back to break even in 3 to 5 years or whatever it is. The problem is you can't apply for a voluntary agreement if you're already under a settlement agreement order, which is what happens to you if you've broken the rules.
Right.
So they broke the rules under Berlusconi. They broke the rules again under Li Yonghong. So when the new guys came in, they had to go and deal with that before they could even think of applying for this voluntary agreement. And yeah, this is all stuff that they need to figure out. and figure out, how can we maintain the oversight, make sure football remains an investable business. And by the way, to all those critics of financial fair play out there, the goal of financial fair play was not to ensure a level playing field, but to turn football as a whole on aggregate into an investable business. Right. So they went from 1.8 billion euros in losses Europe-wide to a profit of 500 million 2 years ago, and I think 130 odd million last year, which means now it is an investable business. Now people can invest in it. Problem is, as you say, Ted, they can't invest very much.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a problem too. So going back, you've been very generous with your time, and I appreciate. We're going to let you go in just a second. But going back to this FIFA fund, like, do you think that this is going to happen? And what does it look like? Do you have any information?
I wrote a whole piece about it, and the information I have is largely in there.
Is it likely? No, sorry. I mean, you have the information that is there. It's detailed. I just is it going to happen? Because we have the report on the bribery stuff, and that still sort of clouds it. And right. You talk about the discomfort of UEFA or FIFA handing out money again.
Yeah, look, I mean, the bribery stuff, and you can read the whole DOJ thing. It's online. Some of the stuff is really funny. You'll find out, for example, that a man named Eugenio Figueiredo. This is my favorite little nugget, and I think you'll appreciate this. He was the head of the Uruguayan FA. He was on the FIFA executive. He was, I think, a vice president of CONMEBOL. In addition to all these dubious, all these other allegations that are in the indictment, there's also counts against him for defrauding the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service in the U.S. And this is because he became a naturalized U.S. citizen. And two of the counts in there relate to him. When you apply for naturalization in the U.S., you have to talk about what your source of income was in the previous 5 years and what you did for a living. And apparently he filed and said that his only source of income was being employed by a company called Decorative Rocks, which presumably make decorative rocks somewhere in California, without mentioning that he was also president of the Uruguayan FA or had this FIFA role, which paid him hundreds of thousands. And the other thing is you have to take a test, a civics test in English or Spanish, I think. And he said he couldn't take the test because he had dementia. And this is while he was running, a multi-million-dollar enterprise.
Look, so Decorative Rocks is a very easy business to run.
Clearly. But I want to stress that all of this all the indictments have to do with stuff that happened, before 2015. A lot of the stuff happened on a regional basis. Put it this way, you look at the sale of television rights, commercial rights, marketing rights, not just to FIFA competitions, but to CONMEBOL, to CONCACAF, especially in the Americas, which is what the main concern of the DOJ indictment is. Right. And there's a lot of questions to be asked. The encouraging thing is none of the people at the top at FIFA now were involved back then. So
we shouldn't paint the current FIFA with that same brush, especially with regard to this fund.
No, I don't think so. I think there's other things that you can raise questions about the current FIFA. And one of them that I mentioned is, as some people may know, the relationship between FIFA on one hand and UEFA and CONMEBOL, the South American Confederation, isn't very good right now. And part of it has to do with the Club World Cup, and part of it has to do with the fact that, FIFA saying, well, we want to create a Club World Cup like the real World Cup, but with club teams. We want to make it 24 teams, and we'll play it in China. Of course, that's been moved because of the pandemic. And they said, this is going to be a real money spinner, and we think it can net, $25 billion over the next 10 years, which is an enormous sum. And, UEFA and others says, okay, well, who's going to come up with these $25 billion? Where's this money coming from?
Right.
And, FIFA were like, oh, well, you don't really need to know this quite yet, and we'd rather not share it. And, now we know it was a fund and put together by a Japanese bank called SoftBank with Saudi money, whatever. But it's that kind of, there's a serious lack of trust, I think, or, between UEFA and FIFA. That is one of the things that could scupper this. But all told, if they can put this money together, and if they can hand it out in the right way, with the right oversight, with strings attached, then I think we can, not so much save football, because I would assume football, like roaches, will probably be around after the asteroids hit, but help football get out of the crisis it's inevitably going to find itself in much quicker if it's done properly.
So you and I both agree on this. There is deep pain coming if nothing were to change right now. Without some sort of fund, there's so much that's been guaranteed in contracts that's locked in. There's so much uncertainty around revenue. Like many clubs, as you noted in your piece, like they need match day revenue, which now is going to disappear. And there's no way that the media companies are going to make up for that match day revenue. It is, in some cases, catastrophic if they're playing football but basically can't get fans in the stadia. And there are a lot, the whole World Football Organization and economic cycle is funded by people who are very rich that are okay with their football club, which is sort of a passion thing, running losses. What happens if the world loses an awful lot of money, including the rich people who no longer have that level of liquidity? Like they just stop funding their football clubs and then boom, 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 the bankruptcies all kick in.
Yeah, so here I think it becomes an issue of timing, right? Because while obviously the picture you paint is pretty apocalyptic, there is one wonderful thing from an owner's perspective about the football industry, which is that at most clubs, you're spending between about 50 to 80% of your costs are labor costs, right? And it's not like having a factory or a workforce where, you're on the hook for these things for life. Every year, 20 to 25% of your squad, i.e. your costs, leave because contracts expire. Right. Not just that, but you can also sometimes sell players and get money back. Right? Isn't that a nice one? So if you know that costs have to be lowered, there is a way that you can negotiate and transition this. You can cut costs over time at football clubs, and you can do it pretty quickly. I think quicker than in many other industries, and you can make it work. The problem is right now is we have this short-term cash flow that we talked about. We have the uncertainty over whether the TV companies are going to pay up and for how much, and how much of a hit they're going to take there, which makes planning difficult. And I think we have a longer-term uncertainty, and I don't want to bore people with accounting stuff, but the way clubs account for players, if you look at, Barcelona's balance sheet, you'll see that, they have like 600 or 700 million of it is the value of their playing squad.
Right. Contracts are treated as assets because they can be traded for money.
Yeah, and that's kind of theoretical, right? Because, if there's a sudden downturn, all these contracts are worth a lot less.
And right, and one thing that we write down 50% of their playing contracts because in many cases it would completely destroy their financial structure.
Precisely, and that's what this fund can address. You can create some financial tools to help clubs navigate that, to help address this situation. You have to be smart. You have to do it in a way that's transparent. You have to do it in a way that, people don't take advantage of this to act irresponsibly. But, in that way, it's no different from the stimulus bill in the United States, right? Oh, look, $2 trillion. Will some people try to take advantage of this? Yeah, probably. In a way that's unethical? Probably. So you have to be vigilant.
Yeah,
but
overall, you got to police it with smart people somehow that understand the financial implications.
Because you can't have those chain reactions. And Ted, one of the most striking things that was pointed out to me, and the UEFA benchmarking report that they publish every year is always sort of a nugget of information, is how many clubs now rely on player trading to boost revenues. And a lot of this player trading stuff is, I don't want to call it accounting sleight of hand, but a lot of it has to do with amortization and depreciation and certain moves that are made for reasons that only seem to have to do with the balance sheet. And that enables owners not to put in more equity. And that's something that, they need to look at and see how to police that.
Sure. All right. So I've got one last picture up on the stream right now, and it's you talking about Naby Keita back in the day. And this was my favorite one that I dug out when I was looking at pictures to throw up there. I call this one Gabby Keita. That's it.
Thank you.
That's all I
Thank
got.
you.
Well, thank you so much for all of your time and your wisdom and your insight into the world of football. And, maybe we'll talk to you again sometime.
Sounds good. My pleasure. And keep up the good work.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.
All right, everybody. That was Gabriele Marcotti. Thank you for tuning in on today's edition of the Stats Bomb podcast and the live pod. I'm going to wrap this up because I've got some meetings that I'm going to be late to otherwise. In the meantime, we will be back next week at 3 p.m. UK time for the live pod with James and myself. And then on Thursday of next week, I believe we are going to record with Oliver Bartlett, who is a sports scientist and leading trainer. He's been with Roger Schmidt over the years. He was also at Borussia Dortmund, I believe. So we're going to dig into his life and his knowledge and see if we can learn some new stuff. Thanks a lot. Keep listening. And if you need anything, we're around on social media, StatsBomb and StatsBomb.com. Cheers. Bye.